That raises a totally kind of different fundamental point when we think about ACT-A services or transition age youth services versus if we could generally characterize adult services. And in adult services, we think a lot about this concept called recovery, this idea of people moving on with their lives in spite of challenges, while managing challenges, while using coping skills and strategies, people getting back to work, starting careers, getting married, getting houses, building families. And a lot of work we've done around that is to help people with skills to manage. And you raise the idea of resiliency. And what's interesting about that, and I'd love to hear thoughts from you all on this, is the idea of resiliency seems to tell us that we can actually help people learn skills and strategies and help them develop ways of thinking and social connections that not only enhance their ability to manage whatever might be going on in terms of a mental health illness, but also manage their success in terms of dealing with trauma, difficult situations, managing and navigating a lot of things. So with this population, it may not be the idea of can we tune up the car and keep it on the road, but the idea of we might be able to put in a whole new kind of engine here or a whole new kind of transmission, and so that it really changes the way that this person can interact with the world if we could. Thoughts about that?
Well, I think, David, you know, as we talk about resilience, and I think about the youth and our interaction, and we work with people that have some experience, that are older. You talk about starting families and buying homes and so forth. Those are individuals that that have made some mistakes, or they feel they've made some mistakes and that they've learned from. The youth that we're talking about, this resilience piece, is they are learning. They're simply learning, and as professionals, we're geared to helping a person make a perfect decision. Well, our decisions could be imperfect because they have to learn and move on. Perfect example would be employment or finding a job. How many jobs have you had whenever you were from 18 to age 23? Probably multiple jobs.
Yes, it's true.
And so forth. And you experimented with those. If I'm working with an 18-year-old, I can't just seek to find that one perfect job that they would feel like they were committed to for the rest of their lives. They need to move throughout that process. They need to experiment with those jobs. But I think the key to the resilience are having those behaviors, having those skills that if they feel they were chewed out a little bit at work by a boss, that they can bounce back the next day and learn from that and ask for some feedback on how they could change, move forward, learn aspects of the job that they weren't performing well in.
So part of those resiliency ideas and skills that Rosie was mentioned can not only serve people in terms of managing whatever might be going on with their mental health, but you're also bringing up the idea of managing what might be going on with their career or their education and in other important areas in their community.
And I hope their relationships as well, because employment is our relationships, their coworkers, their boss, the people that they serve, also their loved ones and so forth. It's the broad spectrum that we're helping them. It all crosses over.
Interconnects that way. Other thoughts about it?
This is especially true in assertive community treatment, because it is this wraparound where they look at the whole person. It's, you know, whether they're safe and secure in their housing, they're safe and secure in every aspect, in their substance use if they have that. All those things are looked at in terms of the whole person. So if there's one thing out of whack, it's going to affect everything else. And so that's the challenge of an assertive community treatment team with this age group, is to look at that individual and all those different facets that we take for granted, because we are, you know, we have safe housing, we have all these things, and we think careers. And this age group, they're not there yet thinking careers. They're just not. And there might be some exceptions, of course. That's the person-centered approach. But you have to look at the fact that they're thinking, I just want to do this today, and I want money for that tomorrow, and let's make sure that everything else is okay. You know, that's what the team should do. How is everything else in their life? So that's the challenge. So
two concepts that I'm hearing out of that I think is important, Tish. One is to think about a lot of the immediacy of decision making and payback. If I can do this, it allows me to do something else, as opposed to here's an investment I'm making for 10 years out or 15 years out, sort of that more immediacy. And the other thing you mentioned there, which I think is an important part of this decision for the state to approach it this way, are these comprehensive act-like teams, where we're thinking about these young adults in kind of a holistic way. We're not just thinking about what do we know about what you say in a meeting, what do we know about how much you weigh, what do we know about your blood pressure, where are you in school, but we're thinking about getting to know them in multiple ways, and part of that is why we have these multiple team members here. Curious if anybody has any thoughts or comments about why it might be so good to have a group of 6 or 7 different folks who might be able to engage with, say, one youth who is transitional age in services with a team.
I really like how we're moving to this integrated whole health concept, so that it's home, health, purpose, community. So we're looking at all aspects of the individual. And I think that's what's important about these sort of community treatment teams. You have the psychiatrist who's going to be thinking about the medications. You have the vocational specialist who's going to be talking with them about their employment and their education. You have a peer, but the peer in the sense of someone with lived experience who is then sharing that hope and how they, have lived beyond just the illness. You have the therapist. So you have that whole team wrapping around that can think about all those different concepts. They meet every morning. They're talking about the individuals, working very closely with them on what are we doing today. And so I think it's important that they are looking at all aspects of that individual. That's what's really going to help them live a healthier life in the community.
So as a group, they can bring in the focus on these different views that you talked about and their understandings.
And the diversity of their experience on that team. So we think that that is a formal team that you have wrapped around the person at the program. But then there are the informal members from outside the community could be brought in or engaged as well that has a stake in seeing that young person succeed. Very oftentimes, whenever you think about youth in this intensive team, you have the schools, you have other educational entities, you have family members, thank you Tish, that are wrapped around these individuals, and you want to ensure that there's some consistency amongst them. They're engaged in the success of that individual as well. And sometimes we overlook that because we're so busy trying to provide those services for that individual that we need to engage or find an efficient way, a secure way, a safe way of communicating or encouraging that young person to communicate with them and bring that information back as well.
And with all of those wraparound services, the research really does show that we can divert people from a life of permanent and total disability. That by working with these transition age youth and young adults early, we prevent them from being in our system possibly 20 years from now. I think that's an important thing that research has shown us.
Which seems like a goal that we could find a lot of common ground on in terms of our idea is not to keep you here, but to get you out of here. Which, and just to come back to a few of these points I heard y'all raising, I heard that the team provides a network of people who look at things from a slightly different perspective, some professional, some personal. They also represent a larger network in the community. Somebody who's an education and employment specialist might know employers, might know the local VR office. Somebody who's a physician might know local nursing offices, might know local hospitals. So the team brings back in the community in some ways in the reflection of dealing with a person. I want to raise one more just kind of thought about having multiple team members. How many of the folks at the age we're thinking with would sit down with a group of people, let's say 6 people, and get along with all of them the same?
Not likely.
Not likely. It might be a challenge.
I think connected to that, from a clinical perspective, when you have an integrated team approach, working with anyone can be frustrating. Working with youth can be frustrating. And with our new approach, where we always build on missteps and always build on things that don't go so well, to where we can not just live a stable life, but we can live a great life. Any 1 or 2 people on a team can be in a place on a day where they cannot see the hope, and the rest of the team can bring back that hope so that the entire team can get back on track for that person.
That's a really interesting observation. I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough in our workforce is the idea of hope. is the idea of conveying hope, is the idea of genuine hope and presence with people. And I like what you're saying there, the idea that you might have a team which is kind of like a chain of hope. And one day you need to rely on this link, and another day you need to rely on that link. But the links actually support each other by being connected as working as a team.
What's described here is that resiliency of a team as well. Because we're teaching, we're coaching these individuals, but there's some fatigue that we have to acknowledge with the team, and we're at different points within our careers. So I think it's very critical for us to coach each other, and I've had the opportunity to work extensively with Tish over time. We find ourselves doing that as well, because these are big jobs, and it's the right thing to do, and it's the noble work that we do.
So I'm also hearing not only does the team help support each other, but it can provide crossover supports and crossover information and crossover perspectives with this population.
And I think, David, if I may.
Sure, please.
The word support. I think that transition age youth have a hard time maybe grasping the idea that they might need support. And they're not just able to do what they want at the onset of a mental illness or whatever is causing their need for a sort of community treatment. That's really difficult concept for them to gather. And not just family, if they have family involved, that they will need this wraparound support. They may be resistive to that at first. And I think the team needs to understand that, and it could be maybe just a couple of people reaching out to them, but yet the other team members working in the background, helping them understand. And eventually, I think they, from my experience, they understand that the support's okay, in that everybody in their life, no matter what age, needs support. Everybody in their lives has support, whether it be, co-workers, whether it be family members, who knows what it would be. But it's hard for somebody who's young, that age group that we're talking about, to understand, what, I need support for something? Not me, I'm cool, I am able to do this. I'm master of my universe. Well, maybe not. So that's a challenge.
Sure. And the issue you raise about supports and supportive people in their lives makes me think of one last issue I'd like to bring up. And that's the issue, and I hate to say it at this point in my life, but that's the issue of age. That's the issue of thinking about this group who's maybe 17 to early 20 years old. And I started to think about, as I started doing this work and I've learned more, who is it that's at the age that you call old? So I'd like to ask you, all of you, just a few comments. You're 17 or 18 years old. What age do you think somebody is old and you wouldn't want to be seen maybe hanging out with them so much at school or in a workplace?
Well, in my experience working with young people, their concept of who they consider a peer, it's pretty narrow compared to me at my age now. So I imagine a 17-year-old, and I hate to say this as well, might even say that anybody approaching 30 is just a little too old.
Okay, great. So approaching 30,
I think it varies, David, as well. I think there's that natural age whenever you start looking at that transition. I'm thinking that high school where you start moving forward and you don't see yourself at that 30 and so forth. So I think that's a natural break. But I also see as these young people are engaged more in the community. I'm thinking about work and employment. I'm thinking about the educational pieces that go on, that they're redefining that continually as they go to work. And let's say you go to work in the construction trade or something where it's very manual, and you have that those individuals that are there that are older, in their 40s, and you're a member of a new team, a new peer group within that. So suddenly those barriers are broken down. And you see that occur and you see that grow. And I think those are the pieces that this team needs to consider as well with those peers and what it really means to have that peer group amongst
I agree,
them.
John, and
So,
I think it's all about who they feel connected with, who relates to them on their level, where they are, and who they feel they can talk to. I think that person could be ageless. I really do.
So.
It's all about connections.
Yeah. I think one thing that we consider when we talk about transition age youth, and it is a very special population, but yet it's a population defined by being the young adult moving into the next world. We also need to consider other transition age groups. Think about those young veterans coming back out of the military that have trauma and so forth. And we hear this in our business and vocational rehabilitation of helping people go to college and university. They see themselves as a distinct group, even though they're 21 and 22 in the college environment. They speak a common language, even though they're there with those same age individuals at a college and university, and they're very impatient. They're very task-oriented and driven. So they've defined themselves, yet they're still transition age youth. So you have these subsets that you have to look for. Think about the musician and those performers, the artistic individuals. So I think it's going to vary with regard to these peer groups.
So people might define by age, they might define by role function, they might define by situation, they might define by the way that we act or interact in the community with them versus ages. I think this is important context for all the work that's going to be covered in all these videos and the work that people are doing in these ACT-A teams with transition age youth. What I'd like to do is I'm going to pose you a question, talk a little bit, and then come back and ask you how we might answer that. So the question I want to leave you with is this, as we wrap this up. What might be the one thing you'd suggest to people who are working on these ACT-A teams that they might do to get to know the culture, the future orientation, the peer sensitivity, the decision making? What's one thing, I'll go around and ask each of you, that you'd recommend that people do in order to get to know the folks they're working with well so they can best serve them? And as we start to sort of wrap this up and for this piece of the video, the one thing that I would just kind of like to throw out there from all this work is just to remind us all of the importance. We're not talking about this group just because they're younger. We're not talking about this group just because they're a little bit different. We are talking about this group because we know that we have a very important opportunity here, as Rosie mentioned, that we have an opportunity that no longer should folks, like I did when I was a very young case manager, be having conversations with young adults about you might never think about going to school, or with his parents about you might never think of this person living out of the house, or a conversation that says you might think that your best hope for income is Social Security. The evidence teaches us now that all those are wrong, and that we should be back to their dreams and their visions and finding ways to help support them, not ways to help them move to a path of disability. So I'm curious, I'd like to ask each one of you, what is the one thing that we could have people do, or that you'd suggest that they do, that they might be able to best understand and work with this population as they start providing services?
I think the most important thing is the resiliency and the hope. And that giving people that hope that you can move beyond that illness, it doesn't have to define you, that we're going to give you those services to help you move beyond that illness. And I think that's really the most important thing, to come in with that attitude. I have hope that this individual can have a healthy and well life living in their community with purpose, with friends and relationships. And so I think that's the biggest thing they can bring, is knowing that that is possible.
Great, thank you. Resiliency and hope. Other thoughts?
I think there's an incredible level of insight found on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you search for how do I deal with my depression, or I just found out I'm schizophrenic, you can find a whole host of videos of young people doing like daily diaries about this is what I'm doing to increase my resiliency. And it's an amazing way to gain some insight into what they think about and how they frame they're just finding out that they're having a mental illness and how they deal with that. And it's an amazing, incredible way to learn how they connect.
So you're suggesting sort of a YouTube sampling of their social context and some of their information, and going back to what you said earlier, I think fits in probably the vast amount of information they can get from all over the world, literally, in some of those things.
Yes, you will learn what hope means to them.
Great, thank you. A couple ideas here?
The individual isn't defined by their diagnosis. In other words, they're just young people. They're young people, and there are many activities, there are many programs, there are many opportunities for young people to learn about themselves in the community. And our job with the ACT-A and vocational rehabilitation is help those individuals plug into that, because they're just people. They're citizens, they're residents of the United States. These are people that there's no reason why they can't just move into those programs as a peer group. It doesn't need to be carved out. It doesn't need to be special. Our job is to make sure that they don't stand out so they can go in and participate in those programs.
So moving forward in a very broad way with a focus on ability as opposed to disability.
Exactly.
Great. Tish?
And within this evidence-based model of a sort of community treatment of being as person-centered as possible, and also understanding that, you know, the context of your life needs to be put on the back burner and replaced with the context of that person's life and what it is today and what they might like just a few years out. And not thinking the way you did when you were that age, which is really hard, I think, for some clinicians. Maybe easier for others. But it is an evidence-based model, but it can be molded around that person in a very effective way.
So like all good evidence-based models, you're talking about the idea of keeping it person-centered, being empathetic, embracing where the person's at, and not superimposing our view on these folks in terms of what they should do, which can be a challenge. Well, thank you all very much for your comments on this. We all hope this will be a useful tape. We hope this is a beginning for you, and you might use this tape both as a method for learning and training and for further discussion. Either way, we appreciate your work and your commitment to serving the young adults of Missouri who have emerging mental illnesses, and your willingness to make a difference in their lives as they move forward to a fulfilling life as a productive member of the state of Missouri. Thank you.